There's an interesting seeming contradiction in the systems of thought that claim to offer a path to spiritual liberation, to liberation from the confining sense of being an individual and the effort and suffering that seems to entail. And the contradiction is this, that on the one hand, these systems, like the tradition from which I more or less come, Advaita Vedanta, non-duality in the Hindu tradition, they say, you're already what you seek. You're already that. In Advaita Vedanta, it would be the self, the pure, stainless, complete, beyond opposites, beyond duality. That about which really nothing can be said, except that nothing can be said. Of course, here we are saying things about it. uh, you're already that, and it's already perfect. On the other hand, put an effort. Put an effort towards self-inquiry. Put an effort towards surrender. Put an effort to read the scriptures. Put an effort to find a teacher, perhaps, right? Put an effort, put an effort, put an effort. So how do you have this? On the one hand, you're already perfect, and there's nothing that needs to be done. And on the other hand, put an effort. Put an effort if you want to be liberated, basically. That's the promise, right? There are all kinds of caveats and ways of trying to wriggle out of that, but effectively, that's what, in a way, is being said. And this is what I like to call the seeker's paradox, because it is a kind of paradox from this point of view. And the seeker has to maintain both sides of the equation in mind, right? On the one hand, they're putting an effort. On the other hand, that they're already that. What it really comes down to is this question of, what does it mean to put an effort? And towards what end? The seeker appears to be caught up in this thing called ignorance, which is a kind of perspective that they have about the world, about who they are, about what they are, and about how they relate to the environment around them. And it's the demolition of this quote-unquote ignorant perspective towards which really the effort is directed. Effort is not really directed to making you become the self, since you already are that, but rather is at the level of ignorance essentially clashing with it and trying to destroy it. So that's one way of looking at it, right? It's not, that's sort of one way of clarifying what's going on, although the reality is it's not a fully satisfactory explanation, because how is ignorance coming in? How is ignorance affecting the self? The self is pure and perfect. Why should there be this need for this effort to destroy ignorance? And the answer to that question really lies in the issue of what effort is and what ignorance is. Because when you look at these two components, effort and ignorance, and you drill them down to the one who is supposed to quote-unquote have them or exert them, to have the ignorance and to exert the effort, you're drawn back into self-inquiry or surrender. When you examine the one who has the effort and exerts, who has the ignorance, and exerts the effort, you drill down long enough, and it turns out that that one doesn't exist. At least not in the way that it was thought to exist. And therefore, who exerted the effort? Who had the ignorance? Nobody exerted the effort. Nobody had the ignorance. And not only is that true at the time, at the point, so-called, of quote-unquote liberation or enlightenment, it turns out to have been true all the time. When there's no one who exerted the effort and who had the ignorance, there was no effort. There was no ignorance. But how is that possible? What is this appearance in which we appear to be caught of? It certainly feels like I'm a seeker and I'm striving and all of this. That's the illusion. That's the mind-bending illusion, right? There's no one caught up in this ignorance. There is no one exerting effort to go beyond it. That's the final truth, the truth of which will be understood when the effort is seemingly exerted to create the seeming destruction of the so-called ignorant perspective, none of which actually exist. But what does it mean that they don't actually exist? To understand the real meaning of their actual non-existence, one has to exert the effort. Seemingly. Seemingly. And what is that effort directed towards? The effort is directed towards this question. Who's exerting the effort? Ultimately, that's what self-inquiry and surrender are always going towards, right? Question the assumptions of the paradigm. That's the work. And the end of that work will be the revelation, the strange, seemingly paradoxical revelation that there was no work, there was no problem, and there was no one who overcame it. This is the mysterious nature of illusion, or Maya. As soon as you try to look closely and understand its workings or its operations, it vanishes. And not only does it vanishes so thoroughly that it becomes apparent that it was never there to begin with. It's almost like you were in a dream and you heard some nonsensical word, right? Giraffe, penguin. I mean, that's actually too nonsensical to even use because it consists of two normal words. Shows you how the mind works, where the mind tries to summon up something nonsensical and ends up with something which is really not nonsensical. But anyway, you have some nonsensical word in a dream. In the dream, you thought it meant something. When you wake up, you recognize the word never meant anything. It never meant anything. This is a similar situation which we're in. The one who's dissatisfied, the one who craves meaning, the one who wants to know the truth, the one who wants the end to suffering, the one who wants liberation. For them, the instruction is given. Okay. Learn who you are by looking inward. And the end of that looking will be that you never looked. There's no one to look. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to destroy. Even in the traditional, Advaita Vedanta texts, right, where they have what's called pure yoga of knowledge, or jnana yoga. And they say very clearly, action doesn't cause liberation. Knowledge causes liberation, because knowledge destroys ignorance. And so there's this idea that knowledge simply it's a mistaken idea, is simply reading those texts and logically assembling their meaning in your mind, oh, now you have knowledge, finished. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm the stainless pure self. That's it, I'm done. No, wrong. Because that's not the actual understanding being referred to. To understand the import of the words, one must understand their reference. And the import of the words in those kinds of texts is always referring, in some sense, to deep parts of your experience. You have to look inside to understand. You cannot simply keep them at a distance at some superficial logical level and understand. So the very action of understanding those words and imbibing that knowledge will require a looking inward. Now, if one has a very, very pure, still mind, in some cases, that action may be close to instantaneous. You know, in the case of Mahakashyapa, who is the founder of Zen, the Buddha is said to have picked up a flower, and Mahakashyapa got it, right? Almost nothing required. Mahakashyapa's mind was so pure. The ancient Indian sage deity Dakshinamurti is said to have initially taught his disciples in silence. Silence was sufficient for their purity of mind. But for almost everybody else, the mind is not so still that it can comprehend and look inward with such intensity so quickly. There are resistances to such looking, and those resistances manifest in dullness of mind or distraction, and those have to be fought off through seeming effort. But what is the effort towards? The effort is towards the comprehension of the knowledge that's given that there is no effort and there is no one putting forward efforts. That's the paradox, right? The effort is towards trying to understand the situation of no effort. That is what the effort is towards. And the end of that effort will be to recognize there was never any effort. So this is the seeker's paradox. As long as you're a seeker, put in effort, keeping in mind that in fact you really are not putting in any effort.